Origin stories, origin stories. Where did we come from? How did we get here? These are the stories that made us the heroes that we are today. Hi, I'm Scott Harris King, and welcome to another episode of Origin Stories. In every episode of Origin Stories, I interview a comic book fan, collector, and reader to learn about their origin stories as a comic book fan, collector, and reader by discussing the 10 individual comic books that most influence them and help shape their experience and shape them as a comic book fan. In this episode, I'm excited to be joined by a special guest. Another friend of mine from the Classic Comic Forum is Roquefort Raider. Now, previously, I've talked with Roquefort Raider at some length on my podcast. He's an expert in Conan comics, Savage Sword of Conan in particular. And so if you're interested in that, I'll put a link down here in the description field below if you want to listen to that. Additionally, Roquefort Raider is also a comic book creator, so I'll have a link to the comic book that he has, this futuristic sci-fi epic that he's been working on for decades. It's really cool. I'll have the links below if you want to check that out. We do discuss it a little bit in our interview, and particularly some of his influences as an artist. Because the other thing I'm particularly excited about here, we're talking about Roquefort Raider, is that he is from Quebec, and so he has a lot of different influences as a comic book fan, reader, and creator than a lot of us here in the US, because he was reading a lot of comics from Europe and France as a kid, as well as the classic American comics. So he has a very diverse and interesting selection of comics to share with us today, and I'm really excited to bring this interview to you all, and I want to thank Roquefort Raider for joining me here. So let's jump right into it and learn his origin story. Thanks for joining me here. I've got my fruit smoothie here. I'm ready to listen and eat my smoothie while I hear about your comic stories.
So my first language is French, obviously, and I grew up reading European comics mostly. Actually, that's not quite true. I started with the Sunday pages, the Tarzan Sunday pages, drawn by Russ Manning, and I still think they're among the best comics ever produced. But I wouldn't say that they got me to start collecting comics. It's really when I started reading the classic of classics, Tintin. Here we can see Red Rackham's Treasure, which was covered at CCF recently. So the adventures of Tintin were read by my mother. I couldn't read yet. I mean, I just looked at the pictures, and my sister and I were allowed 10 pages a night. So each night my mom would break a book open and read 10 pages, and she'd do the voices. And at one point, my sister and I bamboozled our grandmother, who had to mind us for an evening. And we sort of forgot to mention that she was limited to 10 pages a night, so we got her to read the entire thing. Of course, it's a wonderful series. It's technically extraordinary. The stories are interesting. The characters are truly classics. And I really appreciate the fact that it was not spun off into a sister series or anything. I mean, it's really a classic corpus, and that's what it remains to this day.
I hate to say this, but I haven't actually read any of the Tintin, the Tintin. Did I say it? But I've seen the movie, so
yeah, the movie's pretty bad. The movie is pretty bad. I mean, the movie is exactly the direction I do not want that series to go. I mean, that's not the way it's supposed to be presented.
I knew when I was watching it, I went into it thinking, I know the comics are better. Without even seeing the movie, I went in and I was like, I know that what I'm about to see is not representative of what the actual comics are like, but I just haven't, for me, the format is a big thing. And since it's in more of a book format instead of
yes, it is.
issues, It's just something that maybe it's just the distribution system here in the U.S. Like when I'm going to a comic store as a kid, they didn't have that, so I just missed it completely. But it's something that it's on my list of things to check out.
Yeah, it's too bad. It's not that available. In fact, that format issue is a big problem when it comes to European comics. I know that in Britain now they have more and more of these Belgian, French comics that are being translated, but for the longest time, they weren't available in America, not in English. So that's unfortunate. But there are treasures to be discovered there. I mean,
I definitely. I've got a list of things and Tintins on there. So what's your second choice?
Second choice, another one that you probably haven't heard about because that's never been translated. It's the Alix series. This one is The Last Spartan. And Alix is really in the vein of Tintin in the terms of classicism. It's a historical series. There's no fantasy whatsoever at all in it. No magic, no monsters, no wizards. And I would go as far as to say no superhuman barbarians who can defeat single armies. It's really, really realistic. And the point was to have adventures set in the Greco-Roman world. And Alix, the main character, he's a young Gaul, and he's been adopted by a Roman senator, I think. He's got a sidekick, like everybody has a sidekick. And he just travels through the Roman world. And book after book, you discover another aspect of the Roman world. This one is set in Greece, where an old Spartan city is still resisting the conquest by the Romans. And it's a hidden city because it's been a while since Greece has fallen, and it has a wonderful siege scene that lasts for half the book, and I was fascinated by it. I must have been 8 years old, but using those little green soldiers that came in a bag of 100, I replayed that scene again and again and again, building Spartan fortresses out of Lego blocks and just smashing the whole thing to pieces. It was really influential in the way I played, and the way I played influenced the way I made comics eventually, because I just recreated those scenes in my head and eventually drew them. So it's a great series. Sadly, the first 12 books are very good, and then it sort of petered out and then went into other hands, and the series still exists now. It's got a few spin-offs, and none of that is worth the first 12 ones. So second choice, Alix.
I think I've only seen that, I think, on the forums. I think someone had mentioned it, one of our European members, I think, had, because the image looks familiar, but
yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, because in Europe it's very in the French-speaking part of Europe it's very famous. I'm sure it's been translated in German, but I was looking at it this morning, wondering if perhaps Tintin hadn't translated it, and I couldn't find any translation.
So I've got to ask, the little soldiers you were using, was it that ad on the back of the Rage comics for the Roman soldiers, the like 100 and...
I would have paid good money for those Roman soldiers, but they weren't available in Canada, so I had to do with little Vietnam War US Marines. It's all right. One of them had the bayonet, so it sort of looked like a Roman spear. Have to do with what you have.
Okay, great. So I'm curious.
Third one.
You have that.
Your years later. This one will be more familiar, in a certain form. Conan the Barbarian, #4, because this is a French translation. And it's in black and white. Let's look at it. And I'm actually quite happy about that. So these comics were the ones that were available in Quebec, and they were translated. We had this publisher called Édition Héritage, Heritage Editions. And they were publishing Marvel comics, essentially, no DC. DC's came a few years later, but at first it was all Marvel. It was in black and white. And it was always a little late compared to what was published in the US, something like a few months, sometimes a few years later. And at the time, as a kid, I wasn't allowed to read superhero comics because my parents had decided that somehow they were giving me nightmares, which wasn't true. I did have nightmares, but it had nothing to do with my reading superhero comics, but superhero comics were banned. However, in our class, we had a small reading corner where kids could bring stuff from home, and they did bring the odd Hulk or Fantastic Four or Conan the Barbarian. So I got to read the issue there, and I was blown away, that's where my love of Conan started and it never ceased. It became obviously the series I'm most familiar with. And because Conan was not a superhero, he was a guy in a loincloth with a sword, essentially Tarzan with a bigger knife. That I was allowed to read. And so my parents allowed me to read Conan, and I just kept reading, and my interest for Robert E. Howard stories grew from that, and eventually I went into Savage Sword of Conan, and yeah, I'm still a Conan fan to this day. So I like this. The original issue should be number 19, of course. The Marvel comic should be number 19. This one is marked number 4 because they started the series a bit late. And so the first dozen of issues I didn't read until much later. But that was a good start. Barry Smith in black and white.
Yeah, I was going to say black and white. I'm curious about that because I have almost a sense with the publishing, like the printing quality of the time, that the art might actually look better in black and white than it does in color.
It does. It does. It's not a personal bias. It is better in black and white because the colors are kind of muddied in those old comics. The old comic fans tend to say, oh, comics were better in the days, but that's not true of the colors. The colors, at least the printing of the colors, they're much better today. And so when I look at that art in black and white, I can see what the artist was going for. And it's true for Barry Smith, but it's even truer for artists like, let's say, Paul Gulacy, or for Jim Steranko. And the first Master of Kung Fu comics that I read were all in black and white. And you have this chiaroscuro it's amazing. I mean, the shadows are deep. The light is just there. It's brilliant on the page. And when you see it in color, you've got those garish yellows and pinks all over, and you can't see the art anymore. It doesn't look real at all. At all. If it's in black and white, Gulacy looks photorealistic at times. I mean, the famous duel between Shang-Chi and Shen Kui in, I think it was number 38 or 39, they look like photographs. If you look at it in color, it doesn't work. So I didn't begrudge the fact that I had to read those in black and white. I actually preferred that. And that's why I like the essential lines from Marvel.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've got several things I want to follow up on.
Go ahead.
As people that watch my YouTube channel know, I tend to ramble. That's why my videos are all like 2 hours long. But
Yes.
So black and white, yeah. Like I'm slowly putting together a run of Tomb of Dracula, but I actually have the first essential, which is in black and white, and with Gene Colan's art on. I think it's actually better in the essentials in the black and white than it is in the actual original comics. And usually I want to have the originals, but the art does look better in the black and white. The other thing I was going to say is that when I was a kid, I didn't start with superhero books either. My parents didn't stop me from reading them, but I just wasn't that familiar with superheroes. So when I started reading comics, it was mostly science fiction and fantasy. And so Conan was one of the first series that I read. When I first started reading comics, one of the first like 4 or 5 comics I read was an issue of Conan. I want to say it was 166. It might have been 167. It was one of those two. And for me, like the gateway into superhero books was Thor, because I was buying it because it was a fantasy, it was Walt Simonson's run. And so it was like all this fantasy, but then superheroes were guest starring in it. And I was like, oh, I guess that's kind of cool too. And then I started getting them. But Conan, it's just interesting because the market fractured so much and everything went to superheroes. They just sort of got rid of everything else. But I think that was a big mistake because it brought all those other stuff brought in a lot of people that wouldn't maybe have gotten into superheroes originally. I do also have, from last time I went to Quebec, I got one of the black and white French editions from the Heritage. I should have gotten it out. I should have known you were going to have some. It's their reprint of Captain America 154, I think. It was the one where the Cap from the 50s was fighting.
Yeah.
So I have the Quebec edition of that here somewhere.
That's good. That's great. They were a blessing, those comics. I mean, we we managed to get, because Marvel comics were not that well distributed in Quebec. I mean, you could find them in Montreal, of course, you could find them in Quebec, which is a fairly large city, but I was living in the boondocks and we'd never get American comics. And once in a blue moon, you'd get an Archie or, oh my God, an issue of X-Men, but that was very, very rare. So
I should have bought more of them. I was in a bookstore and they had a box of like 20 or 30 from the 70s, and I should have bought all of them, but I didn't. All right, enough about me though. So what do you have at number 4?
Number 4, science fiction. Once again, European, but by then I had started reading superheroes, but I still kept reading European comics. And here comes a major impact in my career as a cartoonist, Philippe Druillet, with Delirius. You might be familiar with Druillet's work. He was one of the founders of Metal Hurlant, which begat heavy metal eventually. And his most famous character is Lone Sloan, I suppose, but he's mostly famous not for characters, but for pages where you've got tons and tons of stuff happening. Let's find a page, a typical Druillet page like this. It's just mad. It's full of details, and it looks as if he was completely stoned when he drew that. And from interviews that you can get on YouTube, it seems that he was most of the time. So Druillet was a major influence on me. Not on me, he was a major influence on the whole generation. He was one of the first cartoonists to do this kind of psychedelic sci-fi blended with fantasy and almost run of consciousness comics in a sci-fi setting. He was one of the first proponents of serious sci-fi comics in Europe, because it was seen as some a sub genre. It was, you just didn't do sci-fi. Not at all. Already doing comics was suspect, but at least you had Asterix, which had sort of a certain nobility about it. But sci-fi was a place you didn't go until people like Druillet came in. Moebius eventually followed suit and started doing sci-fi as well, but Druillet was one of the first to really open the door, and many followed. So Philippe Druillet, that's available in English, and I would definitely recommend it.
It's interesting when I see art like this that I'm familiar with the artist, but I'm not familiar with the work. So my frame of reference is pretty much almost entirely American comics. And when I see his art, it reminds me of, and I'm not sure if either of these people were influences at all, but it reminds me of a weird mix between Kirby and Von Bode. Or I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. It might be Von Bode, but you know the guy I'm talking about from the early 70s, who did like those drug-inspired sort of like cartoony characters and stuff. He did some stuff for like Creepy. That reminds me of the weird mishmash between those two, where it's got the huge, science fiction scapes like Kirby, but the style is much more of a roundy sort of cartoony sort of thing.
Yeah. I would agree that both of these artists share with Druillet that sense of liberty when putting stuff down on the page. I mean, they clearly do not limit themselves with codes and with what is proper and what can be done, and they just do whatever they like. They let their imagination run wild, and you see the result on the page. Those huge double-page spreads with incredible characters and stuff that shouldn't happen, planets running into one another, and that kind of freedom you see in Kirby, you see in Bode, you see in Druillet as well. You see in Moebius as well, I would say, but Moebius came a bit later. So yeah, great artists.
All right.
Next on the list.
Yeah, let's go. Next on the list.
Next on the list. So, which one? I've got two of them. Actually, in all honesty, I must pick this one. So, this is a personal journey through the comics that formed me as an individual. And at that point, I was allowed to read superhero comics. I still read European comics, and I went to college, which is not the actual American college, but it's a high school away from where I lived. So I was in a boarding school, and I was deeply unhappy in that boarding school. And I could go back home every weekend, and when I got there on the Friday night, I went downtown to see at the newsstand if there was something that could be interesting in terms of comics. And I found this line of book, which is digest sized. It's a French translation of American comics again. You might recognize, I think it's Man Thing number 11 that we have here. And these digests were just, it was like a door had opened on the American comics treasure trove. Let's call it that. Because up to then I was limited by what Heritage would translate, which were relatively few titles. You had Captain America, Avengers Hulk, Thor, Conan, Master of Kung Fu, and Dracula, and that was it. But in these digests, the publisher, which is French, it's called Artima, would take everything in the catalog of American comics and put them in these digests that are 180 pages. And you would find the absolute classics in there for peanuts. I mean, this thing cost $1. And what do you have? You have Steve Gerber and Mike Ploug's Man Thing. In the same issue, you've got Barry Smith's Conan. In the same issue, you've got, in this one, Submariner, a very long chapter by Mary Severin in this particular issue. Another title, I'm cheating. This is like choice number 5.5. In this one, another digest. This is the entire Strange Tales run of Jim Starlin's Warlock. The entire thing published in one book for $1. I mean, can you imagine when you're a comic fan and you find that? You can read the entire Warlock story for $1. Brand new. Wow, it was magic. So those comics did wonders for my morale, because then I was so happy to go back home on Fridays to get these comics.
Oh, that's great. As a side benefit, once you got that for $1, you then never have to read anything Jim Starlin writes for the next 40 years.
Exactly.
Over and over. But yeah, that's great. I'm curious, like with the digest, I always think of Archie when I think of digests, and I feel like the digest form here in the US never really took off beyond Archie. You get them at grocery stores, and they're, DC tried around the early 80s to do some digests, and it didn't really take off. Is it something that you saw more of in Canada?
Slightly more. I'd say that it had a little more success. The problem, I think, that with DC's Blue Ribbon Digest is that the printing was crap. I mean, it was essentially printed on toilet paper. So the stories were nice, but you could barely see what was printed then. Pocket Books did a good series of reprints in digest size in the United States. You had the first 6 issues of Spider-Man, the first 6 issues of the Hulk, the first something like 3 issues of Conan, because they changed the disposition of the images, but those were good reprints. Those should have worked. I think that there might have been a market for it, but I don't think it was marketed as much as the rest, because they were books as well. Comics were still sold in newsstands. You had very few specialty shops, and you couldn't find these books in regular bookstores, while these were widely distributed. So yeah, I think the digest market was a bit bigger in France than it was in the US. It's unfortunate because, once again, it's black and white, so the printing is pretty good. It's pretty decent. The images there are quite nice. And a funny story. You might notice that the title is Eclipso, even if it stars Man Thing. That was brought up on the CCF community board. That's because the publisher here didn't care where his characters came from. So he would start by publishing a new digest titled Eclipso. He'd publish the first, how many Eclipso comics are there? 2, 3, something like that. So he published all the stuff with Eclipso in it, and then he just used some other material, retaining the title. So what was it? I think The Unexpected was one of their titles. And it started publishing translation of the mystery stories from DC. And pretty quickly, they were putting McGregor's Black Panther in there. And Steranko's Nick Fury was in The Unexpected. So the titles were just a mix of American titles and American contents. Let's just mix it all. And it was quite enjoyable.
I think I've encountered that a little bit before. I've got when I went to Copenhagen, my cousin lives in Copenhagen, and I got some comics there, and I've got the first issue of Mike Grell's Green Arrow series, except for it was published as an issue of Superman. It's like Superman 391. It's got the Superman logo, but the cover is the cover of Green Arrow. So I guess branding is more important than accuracy with some of these things.
Yeah, and once you've got your title and your distribution deals, you don't want to start over by creating a new title.
Yeah.
That wasn't the era where you rebooted a series every 2 weeks.
The good old.
Let's not go there.
Okay, so what do you have at book number 6?
Book number 6, it's something of a cheat. I cheated earlier by introducing choice number 5.5. This is a cheat because it's not actually a comic. It's one of the first indexes that were published. So I looked it up this morning. Apparently it was published in Canada. I thought it was an American product. And this is the sort of official Marvel Comics index, except that it's not published by Marvel. And it's got a lovely cover by Tim Conrad. And this is an index of all the comics that star Conan the Barbarian. And it's really just how, my God, it's a precursor to the comics.org, the Grand Comics database concept. You've got not articles, but you've got the cover for every Conan the Barbarian comic with what's the title, who are the creators, and goes all the way to issue 60-something, all the way to issue 61. Then you've got the same thing for Savage Sword of Conan, just to issue number 10, because this is a fairly old index. And because there was not yet enough Conan material to fill an index, they also added all that touched sword and sorcery in the Marvel Universe. So you've got all the Khazar comics in there, you've got all the Call comics in there, you've got Savage Tales, of course, and you've got the mystery comics like Tower of Shadows or Creatures on the Loose, because they featured sword and sorcery characters at the time. And this, to me, was a very important publication because it allowed me to dream about what I would get someday if I ever became a millionaire. So I looked at the cover of Savage Tales and I thought, ooh, I know this comic is for sale. Let's go see on the back pages of Savage Sword of Conan. Oh my God, it's on sale for $70. $70, 70 American dollars. That's like 3,000 Canadian dollars. I'll never be able to afford it. But I would dream about it and I would look at those covers and learn them by heart and dream about the stories that were there. So this was what a comic book is supposed to do. It allows us to go elsewhere, to let our imagination run wild. So yeah, it was very, very influential in my collecting habits, let's say. And what's nice is that little by little, I started collecting these books. Conan the Barbarians, for example, it's a 3-issue black and white magazine by Marvel. Very high quality. I mean, you've got a lovely Solomon Kane story in there by Neil Adams. You've got covers by Michael Whelan. That's quite impressive. So
you have the egregious origin of Red Sonja.
Yeah, I got that all. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. It's in Conan the Barbarians. You're right.
Yeah, it is.
Oh well, that's terrible.
Yeah.
I spoke about Sonya before, but oh God, what a wasted character. It's sad.
I wonder if things like comics.org or some of the online resources are still serving that same purpose for new readers now. Because when I was a kid, I had a similar experience, but it was with the Who's Who in the DC universe. Mm-hmm. Would get those, and I had never heard of any of those characters because I just started reading comics, and it had these backstories that would go back 50 years, and I'd be like, wow, you know, who's this character? They look cool. They got a cool name. I've never heard of the comic. I've never seen these people. And it made me want to learn about all of these characters. And I wonder if new readers are getting that online or if they're just not having that experience at all anymore.
I think it's a very important question from a historical perspective and from a marketing perspective as well. Because the attitude I kind of get right now from the publishers is that the readership is so small that it's not worth trying to please to please everybody or to maintain a coherent universe. Just hire a name that people will recognize, hire an artist that's going to sell a few issues, slap the name of the superhero who's popular, and just write a story. I mean, and if in that story you have to kill 3 major characters, doesn't matter. They'll be back next issue. And I think it kills the willing suspension of disbelief. What you just mentioned about looking at certain characters you've never met before and reading part of their backstory and thinking, wow, this is interesting. I want to learn more about these guys. That happened to me as well. And it's part of the reason I enjoyed American comics so much, because there was a sense of history behind them. You'd read a story about Conan, about Shang-Chi, about Superman even. You'd wonder, where did he come from? How come he puts on a pair of glasses and people don't recognize him? Is there a reason for that? Who's Supergirl? They say she's his cousin. How can he have a cousin? And if you found the proper issues, you'd get the answers. And it was worth it because it was supposed to be a coherent story. The fake history of these characters was supposed to be a real one. I mean, with quotation mark. I mean, you weren't allowed to do anything with characters. And I think that sense of history really pushed people to try to get those back issues, to get the whole thing. And now it doesn't happen anymore. For the past few decades, we get reboots very, very often. There's no sense of history at all. I don't care anymore about the characters I knew as a kid. I mean, oh, did you read such and such is gonna die next month? Well, so what? It's not my character anymore. It's not the one with the long history I was interested in. It's just a character who looks like the character I knew, and he's got the same name, but I've got no emotional involvement in that character. So I think, yeah, that new readers cannot benefit from that experience we had when we were younger.
Yeah, when I do my version of this, because I'm going to do one where I go through my 10, one of my books in there is actually a book that was very influential because it led to me not caring about any of the stuff anymore, because it finally just killed off my love of the shared universe because of the disdain. Oh, you know,
I got a story too.
Yeah, I don't know if you were teasing your next pick, but I'll just ask, what do you have for book number 7?
No, it won't be the next one. I put them chronologically. So The next one, I'm about 16 years old. I have started reading American comics in English, not as French translations. And actually, I must credit American comics for teaching me English in the first place. So if my English is awful, blame comics. And comics were still hard to get where I lived. As I said, it was pretty far out from the big towns. But once in a while, we'd go visit my grandmother, who lived in Montreal. And then there was a newsstand with all the titles imaginable. So I would buy them all and just gorge on them. And that's where I discovered the X-Men. And it wasn't love at first sight. A friend of mine was also an X-Men reader, and he was really keen on this new artist, John Byrne. And I thought, well, yeah, he's all right. He draws funny hands, though, and he's not as good as Barry Smith, who was my artistic god at the time. But the story was engaging, and I picked a few issues. And then on one of those trips, I got this issue, X-Men number 134. The issue right before, well, actually, this is the one that introduces Dark Phoenix. She's in a cameo at the end. And the ending was just, whoa! The absolute cliffhanger. The X-Men are in this ship going away, fleeing the Hellfire Club, where they've been severely beaten, and Jean Grey is clearly losing it, and then the ship goes boom as she turns into Dark Phoenix, and I thought, oh my god, I have to subscribe! This moment, I have to subscribe! So I subscribed immediately to the X-Men and 3 other comics, because it was, in those days, you subscribe to 3 titles got it for free, so I took the advantage of doing that. And that's when I started to be a subscriber to comic books. And you could say that I jumped on the train right at the right time, because those were the best years of the X-Men title. And I thought it was amazing. And for many years after that, I was a devoted X-Men fan. I mean, those were the days of the Cold War, when we expected that the Russians would nuke us from one day to the next. And the one thing that I regretted the most is that if the Russians and the Americans blow up the planet, there won't be any more X-Men comics. No, that's a fate worse than death. I mean, I was that kind of comic fan.
Oh, yeah. I same here. I always used to be like, you know, because I grew up in the 80s. I'm a little bit younger than you are, but I, you know, grew up. 80s were my formative period, and it was all this, you know, we're going to be nuked, and
the day after and all that.
Yeah, exactly. And so I just remember thinking, oh, I just hope I live long enough to get to see the end of this storyline. I don't want the world to blow up until, you know, we finish with the mansion siege and Avengers. You know, I want to know what happens before then the world can blow up. It's fine.
Yeah. At least I'll know the end.
Yeah.
Hoping it's a better ending than for the Game of Thrones show on television.
Well.
Okay, we saw the end.
Yeah.
It ends. So
I have a very different experience with X-Men, but I think I'm going to save that because I know we've got more coming up with Jean Grey. So
unfortunately, it's actually the next one.
All right. Well,
it's kind of appropriate that the first chapter and the last chapter of that era of my comics collecting focus on Jean Grey. So after that X-Men issue, I started subscribing. I got subscriptions to several titles. I was a big reader of many comics like Micronauts. I loved Micronauts to death for the first 12 issues. Then I waited for something like 40 issues for it to regain its days of glory, which it never did. I read Conan, of course. I read Man-Thing. I read any comic I could get my hands on. I would buy and read. Legion of Superheroes was there, the Giffen years, the original Giffen years. That was great stuff. So yeah, the late 70s, the early 80s, they were a great period for comic books. Coloring was a bit flunky at the end. Lots of pinks, lots of yellows, bad printing. It got better eventually. And then came, the final chapter in that era, the return of Jean Grey. And we were talking about the historical aspects of those make-believe characters earlier. And the return of Jean Grey to me was and that's overly dramatic, I realize it, but I'm a comic book reader, so sue me. It was a complete betrayal of the contract between comic book readers and comic creators when it comes to these make-believe characters. I mean, we have a sort of an unspoken deal. We will buy your comics, we will accept your outrageous stories about such and such character coming back from the dead using this and that magical device, or because he was not really dead. I mean, when Dr. Octopus was blown up in a nuclear explosion, well, he was not exactly blown up, and we accept that kind of plot device. But when it's clear that a character is dead for real, then he's dead for real. And in the case of Jean Grey, I thought her death had been very well handled. At the end of the Phoenix Saga, she dies in what was an editorially mandated story, but I think that for once, Jim Shooter was in the right. I mean, Jim Shooter was often in the right. He was not a pleasant person to work with, apparently, but I've got a lot of good things to say about some of his decisions. But in that particular case, anyway, I think it was the right thing to do to kill Jean Grey. It was dramatically far more satisfying than just depowering her. It made for a better story. And what Chris Claremont did later with those characters was even better. He showed us how those characters processed grief, how they went through the phases of grief. They had to accept that Jean was gone. When she appeared to come back and it was fake, they had to deal with that as well. And eventually, characters like Scott Summers found somebody else and married her and accepted the fact that, yes, your loved ones can die and it doesn't have to be the end of you. You can rebuild your life. And I thought that was a very positive message. And then all of a sudden, for crass reasons of making more money with the X characters, we get the carpet pulled from under our feet so that they can reform the original X-Men, which nobody wanted, to start this new X-Factor book. And while I understand that it makes sense to have multiple X-Men books since the X-Men make a lot of money, why do it like that? Why tell us to our face, look, kids, those stories we tell you, they're just stories. If you invest any emotion in them, you're a bunch of suckers. Screw you, give us our money, and that's what we want. And I quit comics cold turkey. I read that, I read X Factor #1, and I quit comics for almost a year. I just stopped. I felt really, really, really betrayed. It's not the first time a character dies. I mean, it's fine. It's not the first time a character comes back either. But in this case, it had been very clear that this death was real, and it was undone. So I couldn't accept it. I don't know if you went through the same thing about that issue.
Well, actually, I started reading comics in '84. And so this story was the first time I knew who Jean Grey was. So when she returned, I didn't know who the character was. And reading the story was the introduction. That's how I found out she died.
Okay.
The story was she came back. So I had no idea what was happening. And in retrospect, I completely agree with everything you just said. At the time, I was like, oh, I guess there used to be a different group of X-Men and they're bringing them back. Well, this should be interesting. I was wrong about that. X-Factor is terrible. Personal opinion, I think that series is just tremendously boring.
Yeah.
A couple high points, you know, but very few. I really don't like that title very much. And yeah, I agree with you. My first issue of X-Men was 195, so I had just started reading X-Men like a year before this, less than a year before this. But I think, you know, it didn't take me too long to decide that X Factor 1 was basically the end of the X-Men. You don't really want to read anything past the Jean Grey because they just diluted it more and more and more and spread the characters thinner and thinner and just put out more and more mediocre stuff. And yeah, it really was wasn't the beginning of the end. It was beginning and the end of the end. It was the whole end all at once. But I didn't know it at the time. At the time, I was brand new into comics, so I was like, okay, I guess they bring this character back. I didn't even know she existed. So
yeah. Well, to be fair, the story in and of itself is not bad. I mean, it's the kind of wonky comic book science that you would expect from another title. But the emotional aspect of it, I think, was just unfair to the readers. It shouldn't have been done.
It's kind of where the whole comics industry jumped the shark completely.
Yeah.
It's interesting, 86 is kind of viewed by a lot of comics fans as like this seminal year where all this great stuff, it's like, you know, you get like The Dark Knight, and then, you know, Watchmen comes out in 87, and it's like the beginning of this great new era. And I kind of think it's the other way around. I think a bunch of stuff happened in 86 that ended up just
the new universe
really, really just ruining comics in a lot of ways. It just took a long time for the ramifications of that. But
I think that 1986 might arguably be the year where the old comics died and a new type of good comics came about. Things like The Dark Knight Returns, of course, Watchmen, but also The Shadow, and DC was doing a lot of good stuff at that time. That's when Alan Moore's Swamp Thing came about, then later Hellblazer and Sandman, the whole Vertical line. So it's not as if comics ceased to be good altogether, but that old shared superhero universe, yeah, to me, that's when it pretty much died. After that, it was just the same stories recycled again and again. And
well, I happen to think I agree that there's a lot of good stuff that came out from that period, from DC in particular. However, I think even that has had a negative impact over the long run because there have been so many creators who are not that good but try and copy that. And it's been 3 decades of increasingly bad copies in ways that are worse and worse. And that's where you get stuff like Identity Crisis and stuff like that, where they're just like trying to one up the last, you know, gritty, realistic story. And there are people that just don't have the talent to pull it off. So for me, stuff like, you know, they're good stories and they're well done at the time, but the ramifications they've had in the comic industry since have been mostly negative for me personally. But
yeah, I agree that even a good story can cause a lot of damage to the overall universe and to the overall industry. So,
all right, so I think we're on book 9 now, right? 8,
yes,
whichever
yeah.
one's next.
Yeah. So I quit comics cold turkey, and that's it. Goodbye. Then I left home. I went to graduate school, and I was essentially alone in a new city. And because it was a bigger city, there was something that was not present in my hometown. It was a comic book store. So I thought, well, you've given up comics. Don't go in there. No, don't go in there. No, don't go. So I went in there, bought a few comics. Alan Moore's Swamp Thing was there, and that was all right. And I sort of slowly picked up my bad habits. I did not resume collecting the other titles. I didn't jump on the X-Men and just buy back all the issues I had missed and everything. I just tried other stuff, and little by little, I grew to discover new titles. And chronologically speaking, this one comes next, and it's a very bad comic. It's Starbrand number 11. But it had a huge impact on my life, on my personal life. And it's kind of humbling that such a bad comic could have such an impact. I just mentioned I was in graduate school. I was doing research in molecular biology, and my stuff in the lab was not working well. After 2 years, I still had no publishable result, and I thought, dear, my dreams of becoming a scientist are rapidly coming undone, and I am going to be unemployed, and I won't even graduate, and I should really give up and find something else to do. And I was seriously considering giving up my studies and just doing some other degree in a more marketable skill. And in that story, you've got the main character, who's a gym shooter lookalike, and he's been given superpowers, and he doesn't know what to do with it. And essentially, the guy is a layabout, and he just wants to coast on his past successes. And one of his friends tells him, you know what? You're a loser. You're a loser. You've got all you've got all these skills. You've got, the world is, the sky is the limit. You can do whatever you like as long as you put your mind into it. Stop complaining that it's hard and just do something. And I took it personally. I thought, my God, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm complaining that my research is not going well, and I want to give up because of it. And I thought I was ashamed of myself. Because of a John Byrne comic, because of Starbrand number 11, I was truly ashamed of myself. And I thought, right, well, if it's good for what is it, 75 cents comic, it should be good for me. I mean, I'll just give up. I'll stop thinking about giving up. I am not going to give up. I'm going to stick to my research. I'm going to make it work eventually, and we'll see what happens. And because of that, I had the life I eventually led. I mean, I stayed in school, and I graduated and got my degree and everything. And all of that thanks to John Byrne. Thank you, Mr. Byrne. I won't say that I love all your comics, but this made it.
I was gonna say, I think that's a great story. I was going to make a joke that I've frequently felt ashamed after reading a John Byrne comic, but it's never had a positive impact on me afterwards.
Actually, Byrne had a lot of impact on my artistic style. I mean, I was very influenced by Druillet first, but you couldn't tell anymore. Barry Smith influenced me a lot. John Byrne influenced me as well. I would have liked to be Michael Golden at one point, but that never stuck. So my style looks it's quite similar to John Byrne's right now.
Yeah, I can see it. I see it.
So we're now at number 10. Right on the heels of the previous one, I was still going to that comic shop, and I was enjoying Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, and one of the characters I enjoyed the most in Swamp Thing was John Constantine, that really cool Sting lookalike fellow who was sort of a magician, but not really. And he was just essentially a cool guy in a raincoat. And he got his own title, Hellblazer number 1. And it was something of a surprise. First, I was not overly happy that Constantine would get his own, and it's Constantine, it's not Constantine. It's written in the comic, it's pronounced Tine. So Constantine is he's the main character, and I was not overly happy about it because I thought he worked very well as a supporting member of the cast because you didn't have to explore his past, you didn't have to tell who he was, he could remain mysterious. And in this comic, of course, you deal with his own personal issues and you get to know him as an individual, which makes sense for a comic, of course, but I thought it could easily cause him to lose interest, to become uninteresting. Luckily, that didn't happen. Yes, he lost a lot of mystery because we were exposed to his past and to what made him tick, but the comic was pretty good. Jamie Delano did a very good run in the beginning with a succession of artists. I didn't much like Alfredo Alcala's inking on the first issues, but I mean, he's competent at least, but I thought that his style is more appropriate for things like Conan than for a mystery magazine like Hellblazer, or a horror magazine like Hellblazer, especially in color. But that's neither here nor there. So Constantine grew to Hellblazer became a pretty good comic, I think, and it was not about super monsters and it was not about superpowers. He was not zapping people. It was a very human comic. And many other titles started using the same recipe. I don't know if it's by accident, if all those people weren't trying to imitate Alan Moore some way, but you got all those comics, mostly from DC at first, but eventually it spread throughout the industry, where we were having more and more human elements and more of the British culture as well. That was pretty cool. I had two British friends at the time. They introduced me to beer. I don't know if you've heard about beer. It's pretty standard. And so you had Hellblazer, and this was the door to other things that I enjoyed, like Sandman, like The Adventures of Luther Arkwright, which was a limited series, and many other series that eventually got me to try independent comics, which I hadn't tried all that much till then. Things like Cerebus, things like Nexus, and Berlin was good. Finder, which is a gem of a series. It's published by Carla Speed McNeil. I think she still lives in Annapolis. If you can find Finder, try it. It's a great indie series. It's absolutely unique in terms of science fiction comics. It's wonderful. And all these titles, yeah, I discovered in part because of Hellblazer. And that was a long time ago. It was what, 25 years, 30 years ago perhaps, along those lines. And that was what made me the collector I am today. I don't have a final issue because it would be the 11th. I don't collect much nowadays anymore. Once I finished my Savage Sword of Conan collection, once I finished Savage Tales, I thought, well, that's pretty much it. I don't see the point of collecting more floppies. They're just in long boxes in the house. They take a lot of room. I think that's it. I don't think I'm a collector anymore. I've collected all I had to collect. I still enjoy reading, obviously. I still like reading old stuff, but yeah, I don't think I'll buy a lot more.
It's interesting. I mean, I'm still a hardcore collector. I have piles of comics literally at my feet.
Okay.
I've got a pile of old Lois Lane issues that are literally, I just tripped over while we were talking. But it's interesting, like when I talked to Shaxper last time, he doesn't really collect anymore either. And for him, what happened was he got Batman #9. And he said once he got that, it was a huge thrill, but then everything else paled by comparison, and he just never felt the need to collect anything after that because he just wasn't going to recapture that experience, and it was just all downhill. So he started selling off some of his stuff and just getting the collections as well. But I just find it interesting, the different experiences, because I'm like collecting more than I've ever collected, but a lot of the stuff I've never read it. I want to read it at some point. Mm-hmm. But I'm like, I just want to have it, so.
I know. I was like that for the longest time. When it came to Savage Sword or even to Savage Tales, those were issues I wanted to have. What I had seen in that Marvel Index, I really wanted to own those comics, and not reprints either. I wanted the real thing. But once I got them, I don't know, it's not that I don't understand the desire to collect another series, but there are no other series that touched me so much that I need to have them. So nowadays, if I try a new old series, an old series that I've never read before, I don't really want the old issues. It's probably going to be more practical and cheaper to get reprints. And reprints are so much more available today than they used to be that it's much easier. I'm not mature like Shakespeare though. I'm not going to sell my collection. What I have, I keep. I'm a hoarder. And one of my great how do you define? One of the things I regret most about considering the future is that neither of my sons are interested in comic books. So I got these crates full of precious comics, and I don't know who I'm going to give them to.
Yeah, I've reached the limit of how much space that I can take up. So this week I've actually been selling off things that I no longer want so I can make room for all the new stuff I'm buying in. Just this sort of just like shuffling chairs on the deck of the Titanic. The whole ship of comics is gonna go down at some point, but I'm still gonna be rearranging which issues are in the collection.
Yeah. Proceed with care, because one thing I learned about giving away or selling books is that 2 weeks after you sold them, you need them again.
Yeah.
For some reason or other. Oh yeah, I got that issue. No, I don't have it anymore. I gave it away. Oh, what have I done?
Yeah, I've put together like a Thor collection like 3 or 4 times now. And the last time I almost finished it.
Oh.
I was only missing 4 issues. I was missing 83, 84, 85, and 94. I had all the rest from 86 to 502.
Dear God.
I sold them all. Or traded. I just traded some away. But I realized like I didn't love the run enough to spend the money to finish it.
Okay.
Like, do I love this run so much that I want to spend $4,000 on a Journey into Mystery 83? I was like, I just don't love it that much. And so I just got rid of all of them. It's all or nothing, you know, it's, you know, some people can just collect the one part of the run, but not me. I've got to have the whole thing. So
I wish I could be mature enough to dispose of my collections. I mean, but even those crummy Spider-Woman issues, I'm used to having them and I can't get rid of them.
That's it for this episode of Origin Stories. Again, I want to thank my guest, Roquefort Raider. I really had a great time and I appreciate him joining me here. I hope you enjoyed this look at his comic book journey and found the discussions interesting. Of course, next time I'll be joined by another guest and we'll be learning their origin stories by looking at the 10 comics that shaped them as comic book fans. For now, though, that's it, and thanks so much for joining, and I'll see you next time. Origins, it's where we come from, it's where we've been. Everyone's got one. Origin story.